Thanks everyone for joining this afternoon session. And I just know that the title would be, got too many things in front of me, what an Arizona 911 strategic plan means for local GIS professionals. We have with us Robert Horne with Mission Critical Partners. He's an avid hiker, a microbrew affection GIS subject matter. He's been working for 30 years in public safety. He's an expert in GIS and 911 and highly sought after by local, state, and federal in the industry. When he's not nerding out the most local challenges facing 911 and GIS, he can be scrambling up Mount Mitchell, a 6,300 elevation mountain in North Carolina. He enjoys flight of the finest Asheville craft brews to offer, and he supports the 911 efforts in 14 different states, including Arizona. So go ahead, Robert.
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. I had to look over and check the clock, making sure that it is actually afternoon over there. Here from the mountains of North Carolina in the Eastern time zone, where right now it is a beautiful 70 degrees and sunny. The leaves are falling, so I will apologize when I sneeze in the middle of my presentation because there is a whole lot of leaf dust around. And if I get distracted, it's because the turkey are currently wandering through my backyard. So, like Brian said, I will be talking about the Next Generation 911 GIS Strategic Plan. You may have heard more than once over the past year that the state of Arizona is actively migrating the current 911 backbone across the state to Next Generation 911 technology. You also may have heard that GIS data and analytics play a critical role in the success of that migration. Since this migration is quite complex, the requirements being placed on GIS are new to many in the GIS community and most in 911. The state commissioned a Next-Gen 911 GIS strategic plan to help guide the development of these geospatial components. So today I'm going to lead a discussion on the role of Next-Gen 911 GIS, how that strategic plan will guide the migration process in Arizona. We'll discuss what will change locally, regionally, statewide, and how each data steward will contribute to the migration. Some decisions already have been made, such as the required data and the schema for each data set, while there are other decisions that remain to be decided locally, regionally, and by the state. We'll work through and we'll identify the stakeholders. We'll discuss individual and cooperative roles as defined by the strategic plan. And many of you will play multiple roles in the migration, supporting local GIS and participating in regional cooperative organizations or advising the state. I also would like to review the GIS data requirements for Next-Gen 911 in Arizona, what data sets are required, and the data development options, local data improvement, and we'll close out with a light touch on the regional and statewide data validation process the state will need to put in place to ensure data synchronization between jurisdictions. Depending on the time and feedback from the group, we also may take a deeper dive into the data refinement and regionalization processes. My goal for this is to be an interactive session. I want to answer all of your questions. I want to provide meaningful and actionable guidance. And I want to quell any of the concerns you may have about your individual roles in the success of Next-Gen 911 migration in Arizona and in your jurisdiction. To that end, please feel free to ask questions at any time during this presentation. You can enter your questions into the chat box and Brian will read it out for you. And one last thing, in the corner of each slide is a list of acronyms. I will try to call them out as I introduce them, but I live and breathe these acronyms 40+ hours a week. So if I miss one, please call me out on it. I think it's best to start with a quick overview of the differences between legacy 911 and next generation 911. Today in Arizona, the PSAPs either have what we call enhanced 911 or E911, or in transition to next generation 911. This slide shows a simplified overview of the E911 call flow process. The first iteration of 911 systems 50 years ago only connected the caller to the 911 center, or PSAP, Public Safety Answering Point. The introduction of E911 in the mid to late 1970s added the caller's location for landline calls only, because remember in the 70s we didn't have cell phones. And that came through as an ASCII string to the data feed accompanying the call as it is routed to the PSAP. The call flow from my office phone here in the mountains of North Carolina works like this. I dial 911. A selective router matches my telephone number, the TN, to an ANI record, which provides back the ESN. That emergency service number and the PSAP value that is linked to it are provided back to the selective router, which routes the call to the right PSAP. The 911 center receives the voice and ANI, performs an ALI dip, and receives back my address information. This is what the 911 center sees for information, here on the right. %80 of 911 calls today originate from wireless phones. Using static tables for location information is no longer an effective best practice. In next generation 911, a location information service, an LIS, is created using the GIS data. Caller location is generated by querying the list using a process called the location validation function, or LVF. A spatial query of the address and the PSAP boundaries using a process called the emergency call routing function routes the call to the proper PSAP. The emergency service zones also are queried, and the voice, location information, and recommended first responders all are delivered to the PSAP in tandem. All of this occurs on the EZINet within the next-gen core services. Stepping through this process for a 911 call placed using a landline phone from my house would look like this. My business VoIP phone is programmed with my address, which geocodes in the list with the lat long shown above. That XY value places the call within Madison County PSAP boundary. That's the blue dot on the map. The session initiated protocol, SIP, delivers my voice in tandem with the location and caller data gathered through the call routing process to the Madison County 911 Center. If for some reason the call must be transferred to neighboring Buncombe County, the voice and data are delivered together in the next-gen 911 environment. For my address, the data looks like this. U.S., North Carolina, Madison County, Big Ivy Community, Seven Glens neighborhood. I live on Huckleberry Trail and my house number is 95. So if any of you want to send me Christmas presents, there's my address. All of this information is important because there is a 95 Huckleberry Trail, Weaverville in Buncombe County also. And this is an hour away from my Huckleberry Trail. I regularly will get a call from a delivery or service company that they are going to be late because they went to the wrong address. We both have mailing addresses of Weaverville, even though we're in different counties. It is imperative that GIS populate all of the required attribution for each of the 5 required data sets for Next Gen 911. The system's ability to perform the queries and return the correct routing information depends on the accuracy and completeness of the attribution as well as the positional accuracy of the line work. Canada and Mexico also use 911, and failure to populate the two-character country code has resulted in calls being routed to the wrong country. Gone are the days of knowing that your data is just for your jurisdiction. These data now are being used to populate international data systems. Now, before we continue, I want to pause for a second and make sure that there aren't any questions on the 911 to next-gen 911 migration before we begin. All right. The state of Arizona is transitioning from legacy 911 to next-gen. In the legacy environment, data tables are used for routing 911 calls to the 911 center. The alley table is a record of the telephone numbers, their respective addresses, and the correct PSAP to which a 911 call should be routed. For cell phones, a pseudo record is created for each sector on a cell tower. That PANI for a cell sector is associated with a PSAP. In next-gen 911, spatial queries will replace the legacy table lookup process. The result is dynamic location and call routing service capable not only of locating landline calls, but mobile calls to 911 and accurately routing them to the 911 center. Since GIS is so vital to the success of NextGen in Arizona, the 911 program commissioned a strategic plan to guide the development of next-generation GIS and to support the migration. Robust GIS data is required for every municipality, county, tribal community across Arizona, but GIS capabilities do vary by jurisdiction. The strategic plan identifies this disparity and identifies the needs to remedy the risk and recommends a path forward for success. 911 and GIS staff must make fast friends as you will be working together forever. For simplification of the vast stakeholder community, municipal, tribal, county, and regional authorities are lumped together as jurisdictions or locals, and all state agencies are grouped under the heading of state. The 911 program will lead the effort, but there are many other stakeholders who will be called upon to support key roles in the migration process, as well as ongoing maintenance of the next-gen 911 system. Next-gen 911 is not simply placing GIS data onto the EZNet and maybe updating it as time allows. NG911 is betting the lives of every 911 caller on the accuracy and quality of the GIS data. That quality includes complete attribution. Individual 911 centers and regional 911 systems will consume the GIS data for call routing and CAD mapping applications, but they are not just consumers. Both also must participate with GIS in the data development and maintenance process. The PSAP boundary is strictly used for call routing. We'll say that again. The PSAP boundary is strictly used for call routing. When drawing these boundaries, the 911 center leadership will draw the boundary line to reduce call transfers and shave valuable seconds off of the response time. NextGen is a statewide system, and the GIS data must be seamless across the state and with neighboring states. The development and maintenance of these seamless data sets will require the collaborative efforts of GIS professionals at the local and state levels. To manage these data, a governance structure was established in the strategic plan, designed to foster the collaborative environment while enforcing adherence to the standards and best practices necessary to realize the requisite data quality for NextGen. And the 911 program understands that these goals are not static, nor are they free. Funding sources for updating the plan, building and maintaining the GIS data, and supporting the governance must be continuously available, yet fiscally responsible. And that is a lot of juggling, and the strategic plan recommends a state-level coordinator dedicated to managing the GIS efforts across all of the state agencies, collaborating with local jurisdictions, and implementing the recommendations in the strategic plan. So let's look at those strategic partnerships. GIS has a great deal of responsibility in NextGen, but very little authority. The 911 Center leadership is on the hook for the decisions about PSAP boundary alignment. They must work with their counterparts in neighboring 911 centers to determine the layout of the PSAP boundary for call routing. The MSAG coordinator will be your conduit for correcting errors in the ALI and MSAG tables discovered through the validation process, and for acquiring fresh copies of the data tables to ensure corrections are implemented. Addressing authority varies by jurisdiction. GIS must work hand in hand with every addressing authority within their authoritative boundary. That boundary is also called the provisioning boundary in NextGen 911. Most addressing issues can be made to fit, but some addresses will have to change. So new addresses must make it into the GIS data before construction begins. It will be necessary to create or modify addressing workflows to accommodate the needs of NextGen 911. GIS should start these conversations early and keep an open dialogue going forward. Development of the emergency service boundaries, those for police, fire, and EMS, is the responsibility of leadership within each of the emergency response agencies. Make a friend who has decision authority in each agency and start defining and refining the service boundaries for each. All too often I discover that these agencies maintain what I like to call Crayola maps. They print them out and they mark them up by hand, usually with Sharpies. And then they send you a nice picture from their phone and ask you to make updates to the map. Revisit these connections at least quarterly to check for changes in the boundary alignment. Oh, and one more thing. No GIS program in Arizona is an island. Make friends with your neighboring GIS colleagues. Actively participate in GIS work groups, standards committees, and workshops, kind of like this one. Learn from others and share your best practices and pitfalls. When creating the strategic plan, we examine multiple relationships between groups, processes, and public and private entities. In fact, we had a very complicated brainstorming session as we went through that process. To give you an idea of the level of coordination necessary to make GIS work for NextGen in Arizona, here is the visual relationship process that went into developing the strategic plan. The items in that lovely mustard yellow at the top right corner, they represent the data development process that we're talking about today. Let's take a closer look at the GIS data requirements for your jurisdiction. Any questions on this before I flip to the next slide? Super. Arizona has identified 5 data sets that will be required for NextGen 911. Obviously, the most accurate call routing will be performed using address point location. Where an address point is not available, the location will be provided by road centerline address ranges. The polygon data will be used as follows. The PSAP boundary is for call routing. There cannot be any gaps or overlaps between neighboring PSAP boundaries. A 911 call that geocodes into a gap or an overlap will be default routed. And in some cases, it'll be routed to an answering center in Canada, which will add critical seconds or even minutes to the response effort. If you have a VoIP telephone at home, one that uses the internet rather than traditional copper cabling, that phone most likely will ring to a default center in Canada that VoIP providers contract with, rather than your local PSAP if you fall in one of these gaps or overlaps. An emergency service boundary, ESB, or ESZ, Emergency Service Zone, is a separate response area for fire, law, and EMS. The values for each polygon from where the call geocodes are sent along with the 911 call to the PSAP. This is designed to shave seconds off of the call processing time. The call taker will see the recommended units from each of the response agencies with the call. You can add ESZs for other services as well, such as animal control or utility companies, if you have down power lines or broken water lines. Provisioning boundary identifies the GIS authority for all data sets. If a municipality spans multiple counties or one county maintains all of the GIS data for that municipality, then the provisioning boundary would not follow the jurisdiction line. In most cases, the provisioning boundary is coincident with the jurisdiction boundary. However, it is important to note that if your standard practice is to maintain road center lines a mile or more outside of your county boundary for internal use, that does not adjust your provisioning boundary. You are not the authority for that line work. And when you provision data into the EZNet, the data must be clipped to the provisioning boundary. You cannot create overlaps of road center lines with your neighboring your neighboring 911 authorities. You and your neighboring GIS agency have to coordinate on the exact location where those lines stop and start. The first step to preparing GIS data for NextGen is to create the data. There are 5 required data sets. The road center lines and address points take the longest to develop, but the polygons all require coordination with your neighbors before they can be finalized. If you do not have these data, there are options for the development, but there are no shortcuts. GIS data is expensive to develop, and when done correctly, takes quite some time. There is no substitute for doing it correctly, however. An alternative idea to shortcut the data development process has been making rounds in the 911 community. Just use census Tiger data. If GIS receives pressure to use Tiger data, MCP has released a white paper detailing the dangers of using Tiger data for NextGen that will assist you in making the argument against it. A copy of that white paper will be available to all attendees after this presentation for your review, along with these slides. If you cannot use Tiger data, how are you going to develop your GIS data to stay on schedule within your NextGen 911 migration? Remember, it takes about 18 months to fully prepare your GIS data, and that's if you have a robust GIS program. If you have 1 or 2 analysts and you only have piecemeal GIS data, you can plan for 24 to 36 months. If you have to start from scratch and you have not created any of the data in the tax assessor's office, planning, or engineering agencies, then you're going to have to start from scratch. There are many sources for high-quality GIS data. If you're going to develop these data in-house, start with state or federal orthoimagery. USGS and NGA have orthos for a large portion of the country. The USDA Farm Service Agency flies imagery every 3 years. Both of these data sets are free and high enough quality to serve as a base from which to develop road center lines. If you do not have a GIS professional, you can contract with a GIS firm to develop your road center lines for you. I will caution you, however, the GIS data must be constantly maintained in order to support next-gen operations. GIS data is not a get it, then forget it product. Every change in the real world also must be updated in the GIS data. Regardless of your original data source, your maintenance plan must provide a capable solution for preserving the link between the real world and your GIS data. If you contract for GIS services, you need to plan for monthly, weekly, in some cases daily updates to that GIS data to support next-gen, depending on how much development there is in your jurisdiction. Once the GIS data has been created, it must be validated against the legacy tables it will replace. While the end goal is to be confident enough in GIS data to risk lives on its accuracy, the target GIS needs to shoot for is a 98% match between the legacy tables, ALI and MSAG, and the GIS data. Now, to achieve this, we geocode the ALI records, individual location records of landline phones, against the road center lines and the address points. You can expect to score poorly, even lower than 50%. One misspelling in the ALI will result in multiple failed geocodes. If an apartment complex has a misspelling, you could end up with hundreds of failed geocodes. But conversely, if you correct one misspelling, that may dramatically raise your match rate. This process could take more than a year to complete and must be repeated regularly until your jurisdiction is geospatially routing, every call. You must continue to maintain the GIS and legacy data until every 911 call is geospatially routed. Right now, wireless providers are not capable of sending routable location information with the call from a cell phone. And until wireless providers send that accurate location information with every 911 call every time, selective routers will play a role in call routing. And as long as selective routers are being used, the ALI and MSAG tables must be maintained. Right now, in an urban area outside of Washington, D.C., Fairfax County, Virginia, we are seeing roughly 80% of cell phone calls with routable location information at the time of the call. That means 20% of 911 calls without that ALI and MSAG and the selective router would be default routed to nobody knows where. It depends on the carrier. It depends on the plan that you have with that carrier. Are you an LTE or a basic wireless phone? Burner phones route differently, or pay by the month phones route differently. So all of those calls that don't send routable location information at the time of the call would be default routed. So let's take a closer look at the data validation process. Right now, Arizona is over here on the left-hand side. We're developing road center lines. We're developing site structure address points, adding in the attribution, writing standard operating procedures, developing workflows and validation metrics. We're starting the process of validating the GIS and the MSAG and the GIS and the ALI tables. And we're maintaining that data and repeating it monthly. If you haven't started that process, it's okay. NextGen is going to be a phased approach across Arizona. We aren't just flipping the switch all at once. However, you need to start thinking about this process and what you need to do to ramp up and be able to support it. Once you have your data developed and validated, then you need to start working on your boundaries. The topology for those boundaries has to be perfect. If you have any gaps or overlaps in your provisioning boundary with your neighbors, the data will be rejected by the EZNet in the next-gen core services. So that coordination is absolutely mandatory. And there is no "I was here first, so you have to snap to mine," because remember, those PSAP boundaries are used for call routing, and call transfers, because of PSAP boundary errors, will add seconds to the call processing time, and it could mean the difference between life and death. Eventually, in the third phase of this progression, the data will be aggregated by the state. The state will validate across jurisdictions and then redistribute that data back to all jurisdictions. In NextGen 911, if my 911 center goes dark for some reason, calls using something called the policy routing function, or PRF, can be automatically redirected to a jurisdiction that has capabilities to dispatch and communicate with my first responders. That's based on radio capabilities. So if I have to, what they say in the industry, bug out for any reason, I can flip a switch on my policy routing function and send all of those calls to someone else, or multiple 911 centers if I am a major city and I need to send it to some rural PSAPs. Something fun called geofencing. Every call from this area goes to this PSAP. And finally, once we have that next gen GIS and we're ready for that spatial interface, calls are going to start being spatially routed. And you're going to maintain that ALI and MSAG until all calls from all cell phone providers are all spatially routed. Remember, we're going to reevaluate and adjust and analyze and revalidate every time there is a change in the GIS data. I'm going to pause and take a drink and let you absorb the progression and ask any questions. You guys just want to get out of here early. All right, let's look at the data. Address points. Placement matters. Address points are vital to the call routing process, and they are necessary for vehicular routing. The parcel at the bottom of this graphic only is accessible from the north-south road along the right-hand side of the image. A 911 call placed from almost anywhere on that parcel most likely would geocode to the road center line on that cul-de-sac. Same for vehicle routing within the CAD system. If the location is provided as coordinates because there's not an associated address point, the algorithm may send the vehicle to the cul-de-sac. One saving grace is that the same data used in NextGen also can be provisioned into the CAD system. So the 911 center will see the location on the map and can advise the best possible point of ingress to an incident location. Large campuses with building names rather than individual addresses, kind of like colleges, military bases, federal installations, they will need to be completely readdressed. It is important to maintain an alias table linking the current naming conventions and the new address, as many callers still will reference the student union by name and not by physical address. The NENA required attribution for address points can be found in the NextGen 911 GIS Data Standard STA 006.1.1-2020 Section 3.2. Let's look at road center lines. The development of road center lines for NextGen 911 requires both complete attribution and careful adherence to topology rules. Road center lines must snap to each other, break at boundary edges and intersections with other center lines, and they must be drawn in the direction of increasing addresses. That last requirement is in direct contrast to vehicular routing for road center lines. In one-way, street must be drawn in the direction of travel for vehicular routing. To preserve vehicular routing, the error generated when validating the GIS data for compliance with the Next-Gen 911 core services, you will need to mark all one-way streets with an exception code, and that will allow the system to ignore the error and accept the data. NENA has published guidelines in the Next-Gen 911 GIS Data Model Standard Section 3.1 around the attribution of road center lines. Let me give you a quick anecdotal example of road center line issues. The City of Atlanta drew all of their road center lines in the direction of increasing addresses. When Google absorbed all of those road center lines for their routing application, it accepted the one-way code and the direction that the line was drawn. When I was in Atlanta a couple of weeks ago, I drove the wrong way down one of their roads trying to get to their 911 center because Google told me that I had to turn left on this street. I went one block before I realized I was going the wrong way because all of the cars were parked along the street facing me. Now, fortunately, Atlanta is like a ghost town because of COVID-19, and nobody ran into me. It was because I was paying more attention to my GPS than I was to the actual roads, and no one was killed. However, if you redraw all of your roads to meet the Next-Gen 911 standard, expect that your routing tables for your garbage trucks, for your meter reading trucks, all of those routing tables will be affected, and you'll have folks driving the wrong way down a one-way road. So community names are important attribution in differentiating road center lines. If you have the same name and address range in two different jurisdictions, even a community name, they need to be called out in the attribution. Sometimes this occurs along a very long road with a theoretical address range, and it's split into multiple segments by the development of new roads. If the ranges are not parsed out correctly, you can inadvertently create overlapping address ranges. In the example earlier of my address, the MSAG community and neighborhood values differentiate my address from the one in neighboring county with the same postal address of Weaverville. The topology for road center lines also must be exact. All of these errors will result in the GIS data being rejected by the Next-Gen 911 Next-Gen Core Services system. Remember to accurately divvy up the address range when splitting Pulliam Street in the top graphic. And GIS will find errors in the ALI and MSAG tables while improving the GIS data as well. This is when that friendship you developed with the MSAG coordinator in the 911 center will pay dividends. That person has much experience in submitting error corrections to the ALI provider and can walk you through the process or make a connection for you to submit these changes on your own. Yes, it most likely will be your responsibility to fix the legacy tables as well, or at least identify those errors so that the MSAG coordinator can correct them for you. Gaps and overlaps in the polygon features create areas where calls will not be routed properly, and this adds time to the call process. GIS cannot simply fix these errors without consulting the PSAP leadership to verify the correct geometry. Remember, GIS has the responsibility but not the authority. It is a lot of work to get the GIS data ready for NextGen, and the state already has started the procurement process for an 𝐀𝐫𝐈𝐂 vendor. You guys have any questions on the data that we're going to prepare ahead of the 𝐀𝐫𝐈𝐂? All right. Sounds like everybody knows what they're doing. One that I get quite often: what happens if my jurisdiction, if I get halfway through this process and decide I cannot take it anymore and retire? Well, I hope you documented everything thoroughly. That way, when I come in and rescue your jurisdiction, I know where to pick up. I love documentation, love it. And as you step through these processes, I strongly recommend at least documenting your addressing SOPs. Update them to include GIS. How do you do your data maintenance? What is your process? How often do you do these updates? Where do you get your updates? Do they come in through planning? Do you have a building and permitting office? How do you coordinate the data between all of these agencies? Do you have interlocal and interstate agreements already in place? Have you developed your service level agreements? Your server is maintained by server ops. Do you have an agreement in place that they will support it 24/7? Do you have workflows for your data validation? How about provisioning? Where do you get your data? How do you push it along to the EZNet provider? Have you developed a strategic plan? How about a transition plan? Funding? Do you know how you're going to fund all of this? Do you have a system architecture? This is great use for an intern. They need the experience on their resume, and you need someone to do the mind-numbingly boring, only a psycho like me would love documentation. And by the way, did I mention that I love doing the documentation? This is the part where you guys laugh. I'll pause while you laugh. Okay. But Robert, I feel so overwhelmed and I'm not getting the support I need from my leadership. The 911 program is gearing up to help every jurisdiction in Arizona successfully prepare and maintain the requisite GIS data for NextGen. The strategic plan outlines a recommended staffing plan for the 911 program and other state offices. The greatest risk to success of NextGen 911 migration is the lack of stakeholder literacy. If you receive pushback from your leadership on spending the resources, improving the GIS data to support NextGen, reach out to the 911 program for assistance. They have resources to help leadership understand the importance of local participation to the success and continued operation of the NextGen 911 system. MCP is involved in that outreach and education as well. You can reach out to me and I will find you the right person. I may be the one who helps push that along. Oh, wait, there's more. We only talked about the first half of this workflow. How does the data get from local GIS through to the state? Once the local data is NextGen ready, you have to match your data with your neighbors and pass cross-jurisdictional validation testing. Are there gaps or overlaps in the polygons for PSAP provisioning or emergency services? Did you verify the road centerline address ranges, that they don't overlap and there's no duplicate attribution? Do you and your neighbor both claim an address point because their parcel splits your jurisdictional boundaries and you both tax that parcel? That can't happen in NextGen 911. You have to divide that parcel and assign different address points, or one of you has to give up that address point in NextGen. It won't affect your tax parcels. However, only one of you can provision that data into the NextGen core services. We're into the third box on the GIS data development process. The GIS data will be returned to the jurisdiction with a list of errors to be corrected. This is every neighbor in every state and your neighbors in Mexico as well. Some of these errors will send you back to the beginning of the process, and others will be a very quick fix. The state will piece together the individual jurisdiction's GIS data sets and rerun the validation tests on the aggregate data set. This data will become part of the national fabric supporting NextGen across all of North America. The interoperability of 911 centers only will be limited by their communications infrastructure. Can PSAP A talk to 911 Center B? If the radios are compatible, I could take 911 calls here in the mountains of North Carolina for the city of Flagstaff and dispatch their emergency responders. This is a huge gain in capabilities for jurisdictions like California, where the wildfires are displacing 911 centers. Floods in New Orleans displace 911 centers. Where do they send their calls? Not to another 911 center right next door, also being affected by the floods from a hurricane or the fires from the forest burning. They want to send them counties or states away. And the EZNet makes it possible to reroute 911 callers to any other 911 center, but that requires the GIS data to be seamless across the country. Now, you as GIS professionals no longer creating and maintaining GIS data just for your jurisdiction. You are creating and maintaining a national 911 GIS data fabric. Now, the first step to resolving your GIS data with your neighbors is making sure your GIS data is in the statewide GIS schema. In Appendix B of the NextGen 911 GIS Strategic Plan are details of the statewide NextGen schema. You have two choices for matching the schema. You can migrate the 5 GIS data sets to the statewide schema and maintain them. Now, this will require either migrating all other applications using these data to read from the new schema or maintaining multiple versions of the same data set. That's not ideal. The other option is to create an ETL, extract, transform, and load process to transform your data from its native schema to the statewide NextGen schema. Now, once created, this ETL tool can be used indefinitely as long as the native schema does not change. All of the NENA required attributes must be present in the native schema. The datum for the GIS data is not as simple. Projecting data into the statewide datum often creates slivers. It moves endpoints of road center lines. Edges get offset. And the data development datum and the end datum don't always translate the same. Although in most cases these overlaps and gaps will be small, the spatial interface will reject any data containing even a single small error. It is strongly recommended that the polygon data sets be maintained in the statewide datum. All geodetic data in the NextGen core services uses WGS84 as referenced in NENA STA-010 section 3.4. The state has yet to establish a statewide datum. That's something that you can influence by making sure that you are on working groups and within active boards and commissions. Now, every time you edit a road center line near the jurisdiction boundary, you must revalidate the data with your neighbor. If you establish snap-to points, or static points where neighbors agree the line work will terminate, this assures that your edits do not break the regional topology. This is especially critical in cases where road widening occurs. If you add a turn lane to the approach of an intersection that also serves as a boundary between jurisdictions, your road center line could change. Adhering to the snap-to point, your center line would angle back in the intersection and snap to the original connection point. No need to revalidate your data with your neighbor. Unless you make changes to the attributes, then you have to do that revalidation. Do not change the address range on a road center line without validating the new range against contiguous road center line segments on both ends. Every jurisdiction will have a different set of rules for adjusting the PSAP boundary to reduce call transfers. In my experience, it's a best practice to establish a preliminary PSAP boundary before approaching the 911 center leadership. Work with your neighboring GIS professionals to create a single line between each jurisdiction. When all of the lines, I've worked with jurisdiction maintaining up to 18 boundary lines, are finalized, you can compile them into a single polygon for your jurisdiction. The PSAP boundary most likely will not be perfectly aligned for call routing on the first try. The 911 center may return to GIS for assistance in adjusting one or more boundary lines based on operational discoveries. Now, in addition to maintaining the GIS data with a pace of development in your jurisdiction, you also will receive error reports from the 911 center as errors are discovered with address points or road center line ranges, misrouted calls requiring adjustment to the PSAP boundary. Edits to the road center line and address point data should be validated against the ALI and MSAG to ensure necessary edits also are made to the legacy data. PSAP assignments in an ALI also could be adjusted in the legacy data to accommodate cell tower locations across boundary lines. You may have to remove addresses from your ALI and give them to your neighbors, or vice versa. Edits affecting neighboring jurisdictions also must be validated across jurisdictional boundaries. Collaboration is key to maintaining a statewide next-gen GIS data set. Now, once your data has been resolved with your neighbors, you are almost ready to populate the next-gen core services on the EZNet. There's a recommendation in front of the 911 program to sponsor a GIS readiness assessment for each 911 system. The results of the assessment will provide guidance to each region on where improvements need to be made to support the migration to and the ongoing operation of the next-gen 911 system. The assessment will look at your data, staffing, training, funding, IT position, and make actionable recommendations on improvements. In the meantime, each jurisdiction can begin the data development and improvement process. You will require a copy of your ALI data, which you get from your main provider. Here on the East Coast, it's Verizon. And this could take some time to get if your jurisdiction does not have direct access. Contact your MSAG coordinator to find out. The state will be providing a proposed migration schedule, which also will set the baseline assessment order. This workshop is the first step in the outreach and education plan. We will be holding a similar workshop with our state partners to ensure they each are capable and willing to fulfill their respective role as described in the strategic plan. And if all goes well, the 911 program will work with each of them to develop a guidance document on how they will meet their goals. Finally, the results of the baseline assessments will identify the pilot system or systems who will test the recommendations in the strategic plan. Now, the migration schedule identified in the strategic plan is going to change since staffing at the state is in flux right now. Fingers crossed that they hire folks very soon and can get right back on schedule. Perhaps the most critical next step for the state is the creation of a GIS subcommittee. In addition to creating and approving standards for adoption, the subcommittee also will promote items from the strategic plan for action by the appropriate stakeholders. Whether that's a conduit between the GIS community and 911 leadership, or serve as a guide to all jurisdictions as they navigate next-gen migration process, either way, I strongly recommend that local jurisdictions participate in regional and statewide committees to remain informed and help guide the message and resultant path for GIS through the migration process. We want to identify these roadblocks early, and we want to perform outreach and combine the absolute best practices so that everyone can be successful. I'm going to have one more pause for questions.
So Robert, we had a few different questions, but looks like all the participants are manually muted. So we can
All right.
go to those questions.
Well, yeah, let me see if I can. I don't have the capability of pulling up the chat window because I'm presenting.
Yeah. So do you want me to read the questions, or do you
Let's
have
see.
a few more slides?
I have one more slide, but I'm just we'll hit this slide real quick, and then I will take questions until we run out of time, which will be about a minute. So let me go through this quickly. You're going to get a lot of folks coming in and saying, a lot of vendors coming in and say, we can help you with your next gen. Well, we want to make sure that that wave of vendors knocking on your door, they don't come in and provide you with solutions that you don't necessarily need. Does their solution fit in your strategy, in your strategic plan? Is there a business need? Is this something that you could do in-house? Is it something that you're going to need in year 2 or 3 and you don't need to buy it right now? Use great caution when vendors come in proposing solutions and make sure it's something that you absolutely need. All right. Now, if you have GIS questions, reach out and let me see if I do this. I can stop sharing my screen and I can actually pull up the questions, the chat window. Maybe I can, maybe I can't. If you want to read the first question while I try to figure it out, that would be helpful.
Okay. It got squished on my screen. Hold on. Pull it off. Oh my goodness. If PSAPs must have a perfect topology, should we expect a single source of PSAP polygons, at least in Arizona?
Yes, my recommendation is for the state to collect those and verify topology that everyone worked with their neighbors properly, and then share that topologically correct PSAP and provisioning polygon back to not only the jurisdictions but to the Next Gen Core Services provider or providers for Arizona. You may have more than one.
Next question. In your experience dealing with rural entities such as tribal boundaries where there's no GIS support, are there difference than how a county represents it?
Yes. The easiest answer to that is yes. It's going to depend entirely on individual jurisdictions. So you may do it differently than your neighbor, the next tribal boundary over. There is no set in stone way of doing it other than you have to coordinate with your neighbors. And in some jurisdictions, let's take Nebraska, for example, their PSAP boundary was the top of the sand hill. Well, sand hills move when there are windstorms. So we had to actually come up with a defined boundary that wouldn't move before we could go on any further with the development of their boundaries.
All right. We've just about run out of time. I can unmute everybody, and if anyone has any last-minute questions, we're allowed to chatter then. Any other questions?
Right. I am available for outreach. If you do have questions, feel free to reach out to me. Otherwise, I thank you for your time, and you know, if it's okay, I'll hang out. If folks want to hang out afterwards, Brian, I can be here for another half hour or so.
Okay.
All right. Thank you, folks who are going to your next session. I hope you found it helpful.
Thanks for putting this presentation on. I just got brought in as the GIS coordinator for ADOA for the state, so I am definitely going to be tackling the strategic plan and everything that has been coming up. So definitely look forward to working together, and really appreciate what you've done so far.
Well, thank you very much, Eric, and hopefully, fingers crossed, we'll get out of this plague sometime soon, and we can get together.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
You're going to get on the bike, okay? You're going to get on the bike? Mm-hmm. Good.
Robert, will your slides and white paper be available?
Yeah, I will send those to you and to Jamie. I don't know how you guys are distributing that. I did upload the slides already, and I will send an email to both of you with the white paper so that you can make that available as well.
Okay.
Actually, now that I'm not sharing my screen, I can do that now before I forget.
So, Robert, given that you've basically built the strategic plan for the GIS component, what are you seeing as some of the biggest challenges and hurdles with this evolution of NG 911?
So locally for Arizona, I think that the staffing level at the state, with the amount of responsibility they have, I think that's going to be their biggest hurdle. They have open positions, but the current environment is making it difficult to hire folks, so it's going to take some time. Nationwide, the biggest hurdle I see is the lack of coordination between 𝐈𝐭 providers. So while they're doing a good job of validating their own data, there's no coordination between the providers. So if you and I are neighbors and we have different providers, we have to trust that, or the public has to trust that you and I coordinated, and then when we sent the data to our next-gen core service providers, respectively, they didn't change the data when they loaded it in, because it's not going to validate between the two 𝐈𝐭. So we could be creating slivers and gaps and overlaps between our two jurisdictions inadvertently. And as next-gen propagates across the country, we're going to start seeing those kind of issues coming in.
Got it. And then from kind of an implementation, observing across the country, what state would you say would be kind of like the model to replicate, or at least, glean from?
So there's been some early adopters. Virginia's doing some really good things. They have some jurisdictions who are already routing using geospatial for landline, and they're trying out wireless calls. But they have some issues with their approach. Maryland has the most complex implementation that I've seen. They have a lot of good policy and legislation in place, but there are 24 911 centers in Maryland and 24 different 𝐈𝐭 contracts. So each jurisdiction wrote their own contract, and right now, with 5 counties live, there are 2 providers with the likelihood of a third coming in. So you will have the small state of Maryland with 2 or 3 different providers that have to coordinate across the state. So all of the authority is with the local jurisdiction, and the state is trying to herd those cats with a garden hose. So it'll be interesting. Now, their policy and legislation that's in place is fantastic. Nebraska has some really good coordinating bodies. They have working groups put in place, but they have a lot of rural areas, much like Arizona, that they don't have any kind of service out there. They have a jurisdiction that still dispatches using a fax machine, just because they run 2 or 3 calls a day. So it would not pay them to spend the money on an expensive system. So trying to integrate that has been a challenge, but they do have a fantastic governance structure. So you take all of those pieces and you put it together, and you have the perfect system that unfortunately can't be replicated anywhere because everyone's governance structure or authoritative structure is different. In the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania and the Commonwealth of Virginia, you have your addressing authority is at the lowest or smallest jurisdiction. So a county could have 10 or 15 addressing authorities that they have to coordinate with. So their documentation has to be fantastic, and that workflow has to be solid so that they can get all of that data collected and added into the system to meet the demands. So it's very challenging.
Yeah, I was on a call today, a PSAP manager presentation, and someone was talking about a pretty rural Indian community over in the western part of the state and just not having any GIS data of sort. And I was the one that asked the question with dealing with rural entities, specifically tribal nations, and how you kind of address that hurdle, because the way they internally do their call routing, it's very different for the county that it resides in. That's been my experience in all of this.
And a lot of times those tribal communities, you can only dispatch or respond to a gate or an entrance, and you can't actually respond into the community itself. You have to be invited in. So that adds even another level of complexity. Do you just address that the reservation as the point of ingress? Are they going to allow address